So in the previous video, we got the app running on Android versions earlier than Marshmallow, of course Marshmallow being API 23. Now with API 23, Google changed the way that permissions work, and we looked at that briefly in the top 10 downloader app. So I'm going to run this app again, but what I'm going to do first is close down the API 21 emulator. We're going to start the API 24 emulator that we set up in an earlier video. And this will also be the one that we actually created some contact details in, so that we can display them when we get this app running. So let's fire that one up, the API 24 version. I'll give that a moment to start. I'll just speed this up. Alright, so let's just start the app now. Choosing the API 24. Alright, so I'm going to click on the floating action button. So this time we actually get an error when I click on that button, as you can see there. And scrolling up we can have a look and see permission denial, opening provider on, and then comes up with talking about the com.android.providers.contacts.contactsprovider2. So basically with API 23 and above, it's not actually enough to just request the permissions we need in the manifest. We also need to write some code to request the permissions from the user when the app runs. So before we go too much further, let's actually just review the documentation that we looked at in the top 10 app, the top 10 downloader app. Paste that in. And that was a link that took us to this this page now, working with system permissions. So from here there's two links. There's this declaring permissions link, which takes us to another page, and it's the same as this one here as well. So I can click on either one of those. And that talks about the permissions, or about the new permission system to be correct. So the first thing to note here is that we have to specify the permission in the manifest regardless of which version of Android. Now we've already done that step in the previous video and got it working with API 21 or with our API 21 emulator via using the user's permission tag in the Android manifest.xml file. Another important thing though, if we have a look here, in that second paragraph, is that the system might grant the permission automatically. I'm just highlighting that a little bit on the screen there now. And that's what actually happened in the top 10 downloader app, because the internet permission we needed is classed as a normal permission. So that means that we didn't have to do anything else to be granted permission to access the internet. But accessing the user's contacts is classed as a dangerous permission in Android though, and as a result Android needs us to ask the user to approve the permission before we can get access. Now we didn't really see that when we ran our app in the Lollipop emulator, and that's because the method that Android Studio uses to install apps on the device bypasses the checks that you'd normally see when you install an app from the Google Play App Store. Now, if you recall, earlier in the course we enabled USB debugging on our phones, and you should have seen a dialog pop up asking for confirmation, one that looks like this. So notice that it does say that enabling USB debugging can install apps on your device without notification. So the emulators have USB debugging turned on by default, and that bypasses the normal check for permissions that you'd normally have to accept when installing a new app from the Google Play App Store. So although we don't see it when running our apps from Android Studio, you'd normally have to accept the permissions that the app requested when you actually install it. That's how it worked before Marshmallow, but when Google released Android Marshmallow, they changed the way that permissions worked. So let's go back to that web page and see what it all means for Marshmallow and above. And you can actually get a good description of the change by clicking on the Requesting Permissions at Runtime link. So we're going to the bottom, this one here. And the first paragraph actually talks about this. It describes the differences from the user's perspective. Beginning in Android 6.0, API level 23, users grant permissions to apps while the app is running, not when they install the app. And reading further down, it also states that the user can revoke the permissions at any time by going to the app settings screen. Now, thinking about that, that obviously has implications for us as developers, and that's because we now have to write our apps so that they can handle the situation where a permission that perhaps was granted is no longer granted. It's been sort of denied or refused in the future. Now, for some apps, that might involve us disabling some functionality. An example could be a photo processing app that allows the user to share the modified photo with their contacts. Now, if the user revokes the app's permission to access their contacts, then the app will be unable to share the photo. So in that case, we could just not display the option. The app would still be able to perform its photo manipulation functions, but would be unable to share the result. Now, in the case of our Simple Contacts app, if the user doesn't grant access to the contacts database, then the entire app becomes useless because effectively that's all that it does. And there's a note about this also on the web page. We'll just do a search for revoke. This part here, the user can revoke permissions at any time by going into the app's settings screen. So it's really important to actually be aware of that. And just scrolling down a little bit, this one here is the one that I wanted to point out. Beginning with API 6.0, API level 23, users can revoke permissions from any app at any time, even if the app targets a lower API level. You should test your app to verify that it behaves properly when it's missing a needed permission, regardless of what API level your app targets. Alright, so keeping that in mind, let's go back to our code and look at putting some of this code into practice to cater for this. Alright, first thing we're going to do is add a couple of entries at the top here. Below this line 22, we're going to add a static final, effectively a constant, so a private I should say, static final int. We'll call this one request in uppercase underscore code underscore read underscore contacts. Set that equal to 1. Then we're going to set up a private static boolean, and it's going to be read contacts granted. Set that initially to false. Okay, so we added a couple of constants, and we'll be using those shortly, and I'll explain what they're for when we come to them. Alright, so in terms of the code that we need to write, the first thing to do is to check to see if the app has already been granted the permission that it needs. And we do that by calling the check self permission method. So I'm going to add the code and then we'll just talk a little bit about it. This is going to be under this line where we've set the contact names reference. So I'm going to type int has read contact permission is equal to context compat dot check self permission. Then we're going to pass this. Then we're going to pass manifest dot permission dot read underscore contacts. Read underscore contacts like so. Then we'll add a log D there, and we'll put check self permission equals plus has read contact permission. And the fab button seems to have gone back to what it was before, so r.id.fab again to fix that problem up. And the other thing I'm going to do is at the end of the onCreate method, let's actually also add a log there because it's going to be useful to see where this is being called later. So I'll just put an ends down there right at the last line of the onCreate method. Now, because the new security model was introduced in API 23, and we're targeting Android versions back to API 16, we had to use the v4 support library to get access to the check self-permission method. And you may have saw it when I was typing this context compat, the import went through. And if we have a look, we can see that the context compat is using the v4 support library there with the import got added automatically. All right. Now there is a check self-permission method in the framework, but that will only work for Marshmallow and above. Now both methods return the same result, but the context compat method first checks to see if it's running on Android prior to API 23. Now if it is, it just returns success because the new security model doesn't apply before API 23. Now remember that we defined the permissions we needed in the manifest, so we can use constants defined in the manifest class to specify which permission we're checking. And here you saw that I typed in manifest.permission.read underscore contacts to specify that particular permission. Now having to type manifest.permission.read underscore contacts every time is a bit of a mouthful, so you may often find what's called a static import being used. Now if you're not familiar with static imports in Java, it's just a way effectively to import the static members of a class, and these are usually constants, and it saves having to fully qualify them typing unless I've typed in full there. Now Android Studio will add the static import for us, so first note that android.manifest has been imported to give us access to the Android permission.contacts underscore field. So we have a look at the code there, and you can see there on line 3, import android.manifest has been added automatically. And in the case that I showed you, it was actually the first entry in the list right at the top, but the ordering here isn't really important, so it might appear lower, down. It just really depends what Android Studio does that. But what I can do is I can remove the manifest.permission qualifier from this read context. So I can remove that if I wanted to, like so. And notice how it quickly turned red and then went back to purple again, indicating that something's happened in our import. So we go back and have a look now. Notice that this static line has been added automatically by Android Studio on line 21. And it usually puts this at the end of all the other imports like it has here. But once again, the ordering is important, isn't important, so it doesn't really matter if it does appear further up. So you can see that static imports can be useful and it makes our code a little bit shorter, as you can see there, but do use them sparingly. If you overdo it, they can actually make your code hard to understand and debug. And just as an example, if you have a look why, have a look at the code that's on line 38 or from line 38 on. And if looking at that now, you can see without having the access to the import, it's not now obvious where read underscore contacts is coming from. And if I'd also used a static import for the contract constants, we'd have a lot of constants coming from different classes without being qualified. And that can actually make it harder to see what's going on and where all these constants are coming from. So keep in mind, if you do use static imports, firm suggestion here is to don't overdo it. And I'd actually recommend effectively not using import static for more than one class at a time. Okay, so we've passed a context this. Again, we're looking at the code on line 38. We also passed the constant representing the permission we're interested in the check self permission method. And we'll get back an int result. So let's just check the documentation to see what the return value is. So I'll click on the check self permission and open up the documentation. And you can see that the return values are fairly straightforward. We get one of two constants returned, permission underscore granted if we already have the permission, or permission underscore denied if we don't. Now in Android versions before Marshmallow, we should always get permission underscore granted as long as we've specified the permission in the manifest. Alright, so I'm going to finish the video here now, and in the next video we're going to talk about the permissions and find out where things get a little bit interesting on Marshmallow and above. So I'll see you in that next video.